afternoon. Can I ask for a show of hands, who was in the session this morning?
Wow, sorry.
You guys are really gluttons for punishment.
You said sorry you lost a bet?
Huh? No, we didn't lose that. Okay, so for those of you who were not here this morning, the way this was supposed to work was we've actually put together let me introduce myself. I'm Joel Kolker. As it's been pointed out, I'm unemployed. That's my job. I spent 20 years working for the World Bank and 20 years before that working for USAID. My background's in infrastructure finance. Rachel is head of the
Director of Programs and Investment at the Resilient Water Accelerator, which is an initiative hosted by WaterAid.
And is new, and that's why I can't remember the name, but before that, Rachel was an advisor and consultant to the World Bank, to WEF, to the
African Development Bank, various small.
And prior to that, she worked at the Gates Foundation. So this was supposed to be a summary of a program that the World Bank put together looking at utility creditworthiness. And why creditworthiness? Very succinctly, the problem that we have in the sector, and what we're going to argue tomorrow, and we've been arguing for a long time, is this issue of the viability, bankability, creditworthiness, or sustainability of water, whether wash, irrigation, water resource management, all of this is dependent on two things. One is that the operations, whether in wash, whether it's a utility, a local government, a sanitation department, whatever it is, has to be technically and financially viable, all right? The second part of this is the governance arrangements, the administrative arrangements, and the regulatory arrangements have to be clear and transparent and implemented with integrity. And you may be in container-based sanitation, or rural water supply, or pumps, or desal, or digitalization, or any of the multitude of things that are going on in the water sector. But if our institutions are not technically and financially viable, efficient, and our governance and regulatory arrangements aren't clear and transparent, we will not get the public money or the private resources to do the work that we need to do. So the reason we're talking about money this morning, this afternoon, and again tomorrow, is it's foundational. If we don't do this, everything else that may be your area of expertise ultimately is not going to happen. Now, having said that, none of us are really financial experts, and this connection between water and finance is pretty difficult. Some of us, myself included, can't even find a checkbook anymore. So it's a problem, and we have to get this right, and we put this course together, which is online, and I will share the QR code with you later, and I'm going to ask you to sign up and they'll send some information to you. But you can go through this. It takes several hours. It's a course that's developed for non-financial people who are working in the water sector. And it goes through the modules. Ironically, the first one that we look at has nothing to do with finance. It's governance. And that then leads to a discussion on regulation. Then we look at government support. And the reason we look at government support is most water utilities are not getting private sector finance in the global south. In the global north, there's a massive amount of money moving into the water sector. So if you own any bonds in your portfolio, or you're in the Social Security system or the National Social Security Fund, there is government financial support that's been achieved through the private sector because they issue bonds to pay for our infrastructure. That infrastructure is in the ground for 20, 30, 50 years. And instead of the government funding, they issue bonds. and they pay for that infrastructure. So we talk about that in terms of government financial support. There is some discussion about public-private partnerships, which have worked in a limited number of places. Happy to talk about that. Financial management systems, a whole discussion on tariffs, because while not much in water is clear and easy, one of the few things that is very clear is that we have two sources of revenue, only two sources of revenue. The OECD talks about three: tariffs, taxes, and transfers. The reality is transfers are going way down. There's some school of thought we have a new 3 T's: tariffs, taxes, or trouble. Okay? And we're in trouble because there's an argument, particularly in the emerging market, that our tariffs have to be low because our users can't afford it. Because we only have these two revenue streams, if tariffs aren't covering our O&M and any debt service, operations and maintenance and debt service, there's only one other place it can come from, and that's taxes. You know what the environment is. Nobody likes to pay taxes. It does happens in national health schemes, right? Government comes in, pays for healthcare for people, pre-K education. Some countries have systems where higher education is paid by the government. We in the water sector have never been successful at really getting large transfers through our tax system. So that's why we talk about tariffs quite a bit in the course. We talk about collection expenditures and revenue management in the course. Then we look at non-revenue water. Why? If you had a department store and all of your stock was going out the back door, that's what's happening with non-revenue water. The one thing that we can sell to earn revenue through our taxes is water. And if we can't maintain our water, it's non-revenue. It's a very fancy term for leaks, for those who don't know. It's a problem, and we talk about it in the course. The planning and budgeting process, financial analysis, absolutely key. It's very key to look not at the project level, but at the service provider level, whether it's a utility or a local authority. We then go into the evaluation around the financial analysis. Then we look at approaching commercial financiers, and including in that, we're adding a component on climate finance, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And then we talk about credit enhancements and creditworthiness. So this is the course, which you'll be glad to know we're not going to do today. What we did this morning is we had two experts here, and they'll be in the program in the plenary tomorrow. But we were asked to do the course again, and we kind of pushed back, and we didn't really want to do this, and we certainly didn't want to do it before the program tomorrow because we're letting the cat out of the bag by doing this right now. So you're getting a bit of a preview to what we'll be talking about tomorrow, but much more in depth. And what we did this morning was called what did you call it?
An Ask Me Anything.
An Ask Me Anything session. And this is a little bit difficult because half of you were in the class already and you had great questions, and we could have gone on for hours, which we're going to ask you to repeat or do a second round of questions. But what I'd like to suggest is perhaps Rachel and Robert, who is coming in a couple minutes, to do a brief presentation, again, summarizing what we talked about this morning. First about climate financing, and then you can continue your questions. Just to be very clear and introduce Rachel, climate financing is not a special kind of money. People in the financial sector do not have grants in this pocket, equity here, guarantees in their back pocket, and debt in their other pocket, and then miraculously under their hat, there's climate finance. Climate finance is grants, debt, guarantees, and equity, okay? The key thing on climate finance, and I don't want to steal Rachel's thunder, but it's the use of the money. So imagine you're going to the bank and you're asking for a car loan. and they'll look at your financials to see if you're viable for that car loan. But imagine if the car dealership says, you can't buy that car, you're gonna have to buy this car. And that's part, not all of what this is, but that's part of this. It looks at the output. They're concerned about the inputs on the money that they're providing, but they really look at the outputs. So if it's okay and nobody objects, I'm gonna turn it over to Rachel, ask her to do an introduction, couple minutes, and then we can go and take your questions. There's no dumb questions, trust me, because I've asked them all on this subject. And then when Robert comes back, we'll do a similar thing with him around regulation, okay?
Yeah.
And then I'm gonna pass out some sign-up sheets, just because we've been asked if people wanna take the course, they'll send you information, all right?
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for coming and spending your afternoon with us. So we hope that this will be a good use of your time, and I know that I have some sort of new things that I'd like to say based on the feedback that I got from the morning session. So, hey, that's very exciting when we can be iterative and adaptive. I'm wondering if there's a way of getting to the slides just so I can zip through them.
Yeah, I'll do that while you talk. How's
While
that?
we go. So, here is it, hang on, just in the, oh yeah, there's a whole lot, so we might need to close that down. So basically, climate finance is kind of a buzzword, right? How many of you, well, maybe, let me see how to ask this question. How many of you are actively pursuing climate finance as part of your fundraising or in terms of, helping with your work? You're actively pursuing it, okay. How many of you are interested, climate finance curious? And all of you, okay.
How many of you are scared about it? Okay.
You're right to be. No. So how, and in terms of climate finance, how familiar are you with maybe like low, medium, and high with how climate mitigation finance works? Low, medium, high, kind of low?
Low after today's session.
Okay. How about the difference between climate finance and carbon finance? So there's also, okay. So what we're gonna do, and again, this is just then a repeat. I mean, I've heard from marketers that you have to hear something 7 times before it really sticks in. So, this is what we're gonna do. This is a basic sort of clinic, but it's basically let's orient ourselves around this topic to then have discussion and questions, right? So we're gonna just talk about defining what climate finance is. It's not the same thing as carbon finance, right? So climate finance is this general thing and carbon finance is part of that. We also have the difference between mitigation and adaptation, and then also connect it with the course, right, which is water utility finance and creditworthiness. So here, here's a definition. You can read it. But again, just as Joel says, climate finance is not a new type of finance. It's not like a new, okay, well, the funders are now going to fund climate finance to the absence of, or it's some different, I don't know, arcane thing that now we have to learn. It's basically the same, and it's more rigorous. So it actually has a higher standard in terms of reporting and due diligence at the front end, right? And also then the monitoring, reporting, and verification on the back end, which for me, for those of you who may know me, I'm like, I see Darren in the back. For those of you who may know me, a lot of my career has been around not just the upfront capital costs of putting something in the ground, but making sure that there is a service that goes on forever so that donors don't need to be around anymore. And communities, that's the dream, right? So I get really excited about climate finance because I see that as an opportunity space. But, and again, you can read, for those of you who are here, you recognize that the icon, I didn't actually finish doing the graphic design on the slide, so please excuse the bottom there. So here, this is again the difference then between mitigation. So climate mitigation this is where carbon finance kind of comes in, is in mitigating activities, because the idea is that you can quantify the carbon emissions that you are either abating or mitigating through your work, and you're comparing it against using a standard methodology that has been approved at a global level, and then it can be monetized. So you're kind of taking the carbon emissions and monetizing them. And then, so the thing is that once you put a monetary value on them, you can then trade them You can retire them. You can do nothing with them. You can just sort of note that hey, you're saving these things and you're a lower carbon alternative to business as usual, but that it doesn't actually have a financial value to it. So mitigation activity, but the carbon finance comes in once you're like monetizing it and trading. And I know this gets really wonky. Climate adaptation stuff can work in both directions. And I feel like the development banks actually have a nice joint resolution. So trying to standardize how this works, which is when you are putting in infrastructure, water-related infrastructure, is it contributing to resiliency? So if there is a flood, if there is a drought, will that asset still be able to perform? That is one element of climate adaptation. Another element of climate adaptation is, does it actually also help to actually lower the community or the governments of the country's carbon footprint? So is it actually contributing to climate mitigation? So there's like different ways of thinking about adaptation. Adaptation is often harder to finance. So like also just the things that I didn't do in the morning, most climate finance doesn't go to water. So let's get that out of the way. It's something like between 2 and 3% of climate finance goes to water. And of that, most of it is actually going to climate adaptation in the form of like trying to preserve wetlands or doing these sorts of big nature-based things that don't have, it's more grants. It doesn't actually have a finance component, it's more funding. So these are important kind of things just to keep in mind as context. But here's the rub, I think, for climate finance, and I want to challenge you. Actually, hang on, let me go back. Because one of you who's not here, a woman named Zoe, came up to me after the last session, and she was saying, we have tried to do carbon finance, so this trading of carbon credits, and I'm seeing several of you here might have experience with this. And the reality is, we put, and again, I'll make up fake numbers, but in terms of order of magnitude, we put in $200,000 just to try and get the methods right and actually do the administration to access carbon credits and carbon finance. And actually, we've earned $10,000 in return. So there's this element of, is it even worth it to pursue from a financial perspective when you're doing projects or if you're pursuing a new funding stream? We have to ask whether it's worth it in the context of water, given the market conditions today. And then we also have to question whether or not it's worth it because we are all experiencing this very rapidly heating planet. And so how and where those two things diverge, there's one that maybe is a moral argument or that is a sustainability argument, which shouldn't be all that different from how we all work anyway. But if we're looking to attract climate finance into our work, we also have to question, is it even worth it given the potential financial benefits to us? So, and the reality is that to access that thing that might not be worth it at the end financially actually requires all the same stuff that we need anyway in the water sector. And in terms of utilities, we actually need all the things that this course teaches. So we need good operations, we need clear management, we need strong regulation, we actually need efficiency, in the different systems of operating a water service. So the opportunity, given the standard for climate finance is even that much higher, I see this incredible opportunity because regulation, what climate finance can allow for is demand from regulation, the climate regulation that's at a global level. So instead of, while there's a lot of work that's being done to strengthen regulatory agencies in lower and middle income countries, like what was chatted about in the plenary over before lunch, there's also this thing happening at a global level that's really exciting, driving demand for data and for standards and for methods, right, that are consistent and can be consistently applied. I think that's really exciting, and it might be terrifying for folks in the water sector because we're not used to that. I think there's also an opportunity to not think of water. Think of a water project, maybe don't think of it as a water project. Think of it as a urban infrastructure project. Think of it as a, a housing project, a food, everything needs water. So maybe we're looking to integrate across sectors. And then obviously there's tons of technology benefits. So in terms of, there's just so much technology. We were just chatting before about blockchain. There's machine learning, there's AI, there's satellites, there's sensors. There's a whole lot of stuff that can be used to drive down due diligence costs, basically, to design, prepare, and deliver projects. And that's really what, I should give a plug for the Resilient Water Accelerator. We are a new initiative hosted by WaterAid in the UK. And our mission is to basically drive down the costs of doing project origination and early stage and deal development so that, all of the funders, whether those are public or private, multilateral development agencies or whatnot, they often want to work in water, but they say there are no bankable projects, there are no viable deals. And so our mission is to increase that deal flow and to make sure that those deals are designed from the get-go with climate resiliency in mind, with financial viability in mind, with a long-term operating model, with possibilities for replication and scale across markets. So I'm happy to talk about RWA, but also really happy to be chatting and hearing your experiences too with climate finance. So I'm wondering if could I pose a question to the audience? Would that be okay?
Absolutely.
So in terms of ask me anything, I'm going to ask you guys, for those of you who have had experience with climate finance and trying to access some form of climate finance, I'm wondering if you could share your experience of what didn't work. Because I'm assuming it's been hard. I'm gonna know from my own knowledge that it's challenging. So what didn't work?
Anybody? You all look like deer in the headlights, I think they say.
Shortly after the Cape Town water crisis, sort of 2019 era, we were helping the city of Cape Town apply for GCF funding for expanding their groundwater extraction to diversify their water supply as an adaptation measure. We had commitment from the head of GCF at the time to the mayor of Cape Town that he would do a transaction, and we still couldn't get there. Part of it was that Cape Town was sitting because of the way they'd run their tariffs, and they had a large, they had quite a bit of cash on hand. They weren't interested in debt financing, and therefore to get the grant mix, and GCF said, well, no, you're Cape Town, you're not you're not lower income country, we're not gonna up your grant proportion. And so as a friend often says, the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. The amount of
Are you related to Rachel?
I use that metaphor quite a bit.
Does anybody know what GCF is? Okay, this is the, yes, no? Sorry, the green, no, the green fund. Yeah, it's based in Seoul. It's one of the big multilateral organizations that are funded for a lot of the prep work. But now that I'm employed and have no loyalty to anyone, I will tell you that it's also an organization that has a reputation of being very difficult to get money out of, so.
Yeah, okay, so Cape Town, so the issue was perhaps the sort of rules and regs of the funder who didn't, even though you had a business case and you had a,
We had a business case, we had it all, but the
need.
finance just wasn't attractive. It just wasn't worth it amongst all the other cities' priorities at that point.
Yeah.
So that was a challenge. More recently, we looked into trying to get carbon credits, well, urban wash as well. Carbon credits for citywide pit emptying, but the science didn't back up on that one.
yeah.
So
This is where that sort of additional standard becomes really important, and anytime you look at a standard, you also look at layers and layers of kind of process, right, to get the science and the methodology approved. It's never as simple as that, the clarity of an idea, right, to actually implement it. So I'm just kind of curious, is there other experience in the room in terms of, working with carbon, trying to access either carbon finance or do climate finance for adaptation that, and what was the thing, the barrier, you think?
So,
Isabel.
At CBSA Container-Based Sanitation Alliance, we've been looking into carbon credits for container-based sanitation. which massively reduces methane emissions. And we found, first of all, it's just such a complex and laborious process that it's so technical, but it's a similar thing. I mean, I think we found that there is some potential there to get some revenue, but the costs of certification are so high, they reduce the return by about 40%. It also requires quite a lot of scale, so it's hard for small projects to access.
So just to clarify and go back to one of the points I was making, this is not in putting the package together for the money. Rather, she's talking about the process to prove that you are mitigating or dealing with the environmental concerns. And I've seen projects as big as getting grants for $20 million to do that process to prove that this is climate appropriate to get the financing. So this is a little different, or a lot different, from a lot of the other kinds of financing that we've dealt with in the water sector, which is one of the many reasons why we haven't been particularly successful at securing these resources. It's not something we think about, and a lot of the information, the baseline information, the science behind it that they're looking for to justify the financing is not readily available, or people don't fully understand what they're looking for.
Yeah. So then in the meantime, we can go back to, all right, well, let's look and see what does a functioning and financially viable service provider look like? Independent of the climate finance, let's just talk about financial viability, and which is where this course, if you scan the QR code, becomes really valuable, because we start looking at some of the same things that you need in terms of that due diligence, like showing operational efficiency, showing even if it's a shadow credit rating, right? Even if it's a self-assessment where you're showing progress toward those things, toward becoming creditworthy. Those are things that will help you access climate-related finance right down the road. I think one of the things that I've certainly run into this trap, being a water sector person, is, when I get tired of the water sector, I look longingly over at the climate sector and say, oh gosh, look at the scale that they've achieved. Look at how, I don't know, they must serve nicer food. They must be right? The climate, they seem to have their act together, or the forestry crowd, they seem to have their act together. But when you then jump over and you recognize, and you look, you spend some time in those sectors, you realize actually they're just figuring things out too. And so we're working in a system where I think that we know in the water, we actually know what it takes for a utility to be financially viable. Address non-revenue water, right? Get down from 80% to 20%. Make sure you have a call center so that when people have complaints that they are responded. Oh, and actually before we start talking about PPPs and trying to whatever, actually make sure that people are paying their bills. Make sure the government is paying its water bills, right? It's not always the poorest of the poor that aren't paying their water bills. It's the government that's not paying its bills, or companies that aren't paying their bills. We also have, other ways of looking at the market, right? Maybe thinking about, well, if the utility is only providing half the city with water or with sewerage, probably less than half of the city with sewerage, well, obviously the other half is getting water from somewhere. So let's look at those. Who's doing that? Because people aren't dying for lack of water in most places around the world. They're getting water from somewhere, and it might not be at the standards we need. It might not be at the price that we like, but actually it's getting done. So are there ways of turning our attention, toward the whole market of water service provision and trying to improve the creditworthiness of that, which of course raises the importance and profile of regulation, which Robert will talk about. But I think there's something of getting those basics right. I feel like we know in the water sector how to do that, and yet we're not doing it, as well or as fast as we'd like. And so there's something of, climate finance is shiny. It's this new thing, but it's actually not. It still requires all of those basics. So this is sort of a call to action about okay, what can we do? And it's again, I know there's questions, you guys have questions for me, but I also want to know, what can we do and each take sort of, accountability for to get these numbers better, to get performance raised in terms of utilities and service providers in the countries and cities where we're operating. But there's a question in the back, yes?
Yes, I'm sorry to raise this point. I'm from Haiti. I came to this presentation very late. Perhaps you already addressed the concern I'm going to expose to you. I'm working at the Ministry of Environment of Haiti. Okay, we have the mandate to involve, to train, to take some legal steps directed to local entrepreneurs to put them in a situation where they can find some money in the carbon market, not specifically with water as a whole. Experience showed with the clean mechanism development, by the time for countries like Haiti that lacks a lot of capacity, by the time you get some capacity, you get familiar with methodology, to account, the accountable methodology to see the progress you are making, and the money, I would not say it's gone, but it's difficult to get access. My question or clarification to you, what kind of advice you can give countries lacking capacity of Haiti and trying to involve local players, even if the water market? So what kind of, based on your experience, on your knowledge on the matter, what kind of advice you can give us to try to get on board with this emerging opportunity?
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to divert this question to Joel as a newly retired person. Do you think that it is, so would you advise trying to get money out of one of these dedicated grant-based or, concessionary climate finance, nominally things, do you think it would be easier or harder to get funding from the World Bank or, one of the regional development banks than just in your experience?
Okay, so before we get to where the money is, let's talk about what to do, okay? Because I think that's a challenge. We've all worked in fragile states, or many of us have worked in fragile states, and the challenge is that there are so many challenges, you're overwhelmed, right? And that is a real legitimate problem. And it's a particular problem when the governance arrangements aren't clear and transparent, and whether everyone's talking about private sector and there is no private sector in the country, right? So my first statement is simply, you're not alone. This happens in more places than we care to think about, and it is an issue and it's legitimate, but the real question is, what are you trying to do and what should be the priority? Is it water? You have a cholera outbreak, is it sanitation? So you've got to start with that. And then if it's water supply, how are you going to deliver? What does that mean? Collections, there's all of these issues that you have to prioritize. We know, however, back to one of the early statements I said, there's only two sources, effectively, there's only two sources of revenue. You're either going to get it from the consumer through some kind of tariff, or you're going to get it from basically the fiscus through taxes. There's no other source. So you have to look at your revenue stream and then tailor your initial remedies along that line. Now, it may be using tanker trucks, which I generally don't recommend, but that may be a potential short-term solution. It may be looking where you do have water assets, but you have high levels of leaks or non-revenue water. It may be focusing on that. Where you are providing water and people aren't paying for the service, it may be focusing on the collection end of it. On private sector contributions, I wouldn't generally go to the banks. I would leave it to things like microfinance institutions, rather than big commercial banks, which if you're not viable in terms of your efficiency of your operations, that means you're not going to be creditworthy. So be realistic in what you can do and what opportunities you have to take it forward, and do it step by step. But there's no quick solution here. Now, there are the multilateral development banks, and there's a lot of technical people in them who can provide the resources, and there's financing and all kinds of things. But I don't want to go through that as a solution, because they are rather slow in how they react. The bilaterals tend to be faster, and that tends to have grant money, and that's another way to do this. So that's rather a lengthy explanation to a difficult situation, but I guess what I'm really saying is, look at the assets you have, and I don't mean your infrastructure assets, I mean the assets you have as a service provider. Build on them, build up your revenue stream where you can, and then look at prioritizing the services as well as the investments you're making.
Yeah, it is this hard thing, because we often look for grant funding, or we're project, I think a lot of water services and sanitation services, we have this bias toward projectizing things, to say, oh, let's go hunt for this bit of money and this bit of money and this bit of money. And I know that local municipalities in the US have the same issue. Oftentimes, they have enough budget to cover their salaries, but not enough to actually finance things, right? And yet, if we can do fewer things better, right? Do a few things, pick one thing maybe, and do that really well. And maybe it's figuring out how do you get a tanker truck situation. Maybe it's fixing the leaks in an area that has a lot of water leaks. Maybe it's something, but do one thing and really get good at it. And even in this sort of crisis mode that many utilities are in all the time, that's the step it's like a step on the path toward better operating efficiency. Because honestly, as someone, so when I worked at the Gates Foundation, we had so it's a little bit of a different thing, but having a funder perspective, the perspective of being a funder and having to make big grants. It's very hard to make a big grant, and it's very hard to absorb a big grant as an organization, right? It often distracts from the core mission, because suddenly you have all these new things that you have to do, because you've created a new project that then has to be managed, and it detracts a little bit from core services, even with the prestige or the, it's great to win a grant, right? Then be like, yeah, free money, but it's never free. And so that's this conundrum of the climate finance space, is it seems very shiny, and we are a little bit of the splash of cold water to say, this is hard, it's going to be challenging, and the best way to get and be mainstreamed into the climate finance conversation is to do really well with what we do already and the challenges that we have already, just getting water to customers and getting customers to pay their bills.
So we have about 15 minutes before we're going to move over to regulations. So if it's all right, I'm going to try to take 2 or 3 questions and then ask Rachel to address them.
You made a point about climate financing not being a new thing, but on net, is it additional funding available to the sector, or by recategorizing funds? You talked about transfers are going down. Is climate financing displacing north-south transfers, and we end up with either a net zero or a net zero with the added barrier of not being able to access it because of the regulations?
All right, I'm going to take a couple more questions so she can think about these answers.
Sorry, earlier in the day, I think had shown something about the expectation of the same level of returns, plus the
Financial returns.
yeah,
you're
financial
talking about.
returns.
Okay, so you want to know about the financial returns on climate finance?
No. So it said that it was the same level of financial return on investment. The expectations were the same, which to me it sounds like, well, they're thinking of an opportunity cost that I'm putting in elsewhere. Plus, it's the added reporting or the the effort to prove that your outcomes are indeed in line with that. The question actually is, by opportunity cost is one where either there is like zero impact or there's a chance that actually it is contributing to GHG emissions. Something else that I'm funding also over here. Do the standards or so in terms of, speak about how you might be able to discount the rate of, say interest rates or so, which ultimately will influence your ROI, right? Because you're funding a climate project. So I'm just trying to understand if there's a delta over there, because that doesn't make sense that you have the same expectation of return for something which is GHG adaptation, mitigation, or versus something that does not do it.
Sorry, just want to make sure I understand this. You're saying you basically take a cut on your return on investment for the greater good of the climate impact. So
Has anybody not priced this?
Okay, all right,
Yeah.
I'm gonna let Rachel reply to that. One more question? Okay, why don't you
Okay, we'll
start?
attack okay, so this idea of kind of the aid flows question and sort of, is this a shrinking pie or is the overall pie getting bigger? What's going on? Obviously, this is sort of like, all of us might have a different opinion about this. It's that metaphor of the putting your hand on the elephant in the dark, but here's my take, right? So what I'm seeing is over the last, 20 years of looking at OECD, of like aid flows and whatnot, there's been a shift away from grants toward more like interest-bearing loans in the aid space. There's also been a move toward more tied aid. So a lot of the core water donors are now looking to tie their aid, particularly in lower middle income countries, your Ghanas, your Ugandas, your Zambias. They're looking to actually make it that more tied to their own country, like businesses basically, as trade, not aid. And you also have this sort of crisis of the migrant crisis, where governments are increasingly saying, well, the aid money that we are spending on, housing and sheltering migrants, climate effectively, a lot of them they're conflict migrants, and there's also refugees, and a lot of that, one could argue, is driven from the climate crisis, that actually can be diverted from foreign assistance. And so you do have this confluence of factors that I think is shrinking the pie, to be honest, of overall aid. And then within that, only 2 or 3% of climate finance, so finance that gets tagged as climate oriented, actually goes to water related stuff. So a lot of the climate finance is going to direct carbon capture, it's going to energy sector stuff, so it's not actually getting channeled to water related investments. So in a way, we're already kind of off balance and not on a good footing to be able to access this money because we don't have a good story to tell. We're already sort of marginal. And so that's what I would say, that's the piece of the elephant that I see, right, is that dynamic. And so in a way, well, how do we do better? Well, we do better with the resources that we have. We make the best with the resources we have, not completely isolating ourselves from this wider picture and interesting trends going on. Because ultimately, I think what keeps me in the water space for all this time is, at some point, the threat of water security is going to surpass people's hesitance to engage. And at that point, I do really truly believe that all of us water sector professionals are either going to be completely bypassed by, other sector people will come in and they'll be like, we know how to do water and we got it and we're done. What is all this stuff? Because water people make it all very confusing of, what about this and what about that? And we need to make sure it has this. We need to make sure oh my God, we have to remember that's it. Like, right? Someone's going to come in and be like, I see it also just like there's this guy. He totally is on an evangelical, not actually religious, but just evangelical drive to commoditize water. And I see it living in the US West where water is a private good. If you do that, you have hedge funds owning farms. There's a whole lot of stuff we could talk about when it comes to finance and how water gets financed that I think would be very unsettling for the development crowd. And if we can't get the basic operating efficiencies in place in our water service providers, I think we run the risk actually of being just completely overwhelmed by other people who have a very different agenda. And I think that time is coming soon. So, okay, financial returns, the more fun thing. So the difference when I mentioned the thing on the financial returns, that's for the private investors. So if you talk to private equity, if you talk to institutional investors, and so what they're looking for is they want that return. So let's just say it's 15%. If they can't make 15% on a model, they will not do the project unless they have layered, I'm not going to use the word blending because I hate that term, blended finance. They will want to layer in tranches of grant funding, or in some countries it's called viability gap finance or something, so that they get their return.
And there's no.
That has been, so that's research.
There's no global, so the thing is you have a standard in terms of reporting the outcomes and all, that's the expectation, but there is no standard put in place to say that you discount. It's like this, I mean, I'm using $100, I'm putting extremes over here, can I give it to an oil and gas, someone is like burning something up over there,
Yeah.
or do I give it to a project which is clearly like, well, it is trying to do something which is bringing it down. It's not about doing good, it's just about has that been priced into, there's no standard that says you can discount it by so much.
No, and so what I think is actually kind of interesting is the oil and gas might even get a lower, like a better discount rate, because we know how to finance oil and gas. We don't know how to finance water. And so there's a premium because water is such an unknown. The investment bankers don't know how to, they don't have standard models for investing in water because it's such a nascent market. And so in fact, then their return expectation is higher. So it doesn't necessarily make sense. I made a pitch to one of your former colleagues at the bank of, if you really want to get more climate finance into water, why can't you make the discount rate for water projects much more favorable than for, I don't know, oil and gas or energy? Like, why can't we just play with the interest rates?
Yeah.
And the answer was quite interesting. So that's, I don't know if you were on the call, Sean was on the call, but it's one of these really interesting things where they're, you know what, to do that would require political buy-in from all of the World Bank member countries. And we already just went through a massive headache with this other policy. Like, there's just no appetite for doing anything like that would be that radical. There's something of like, if the World Bank is going to say we want to go off fossil, I think they are. They're no longer lending to fossil fuel driven stuff. But those are really big changes and very big hurdles for countries to swallow. And so no, like there's a need for a grant. There's just always going to be the private investors want that. And private investors kind of, I've had more than one private investor when I've spoken with them about water say, well, we want a return and we want that return guaranteed. And I say, well, if your premium is high, why, aren't you also taking a risk? The whole point of the private sector is to take a risk. I'm like, no, only if it's completely assured, then we'll invest.
Then take a risk.
And so,
Keep in mind that most of the private money going into the water sector in the global north is coming from bonds, okay?
Yes.
And it's coming from pension funds and insurance companies. It's looking for long-term investment. So this is not the dot-com guys or the blockchain guys who are looking for high-level returns. They're looking for security and safety. And they're getting a bit of a haircut depending on the country, by the tax advantage. So they're generally pretty okay with this. And
totally important point, that this is also your 401ks, your pension funds, they want, this is fixed income, would be the target market. There's certainly, more private equity investors in the tax side, but they want long-term stable returns. And ultimately, this is the rub, is that in our global financial market, we all are wanting that stable return as well. And so there is a tension that's worth just at least coming to terms with, right? As we then have to figure out and sit with that problem to then figure out pathways through, which is, I think, the challenge for everybody here. Okay.
couple more questions.
So can I just ask one tiny clarification? All the problems that you're speaking about, what we're talking about today, I kind of assume that's a climate finance problem and it's not a water problem, or am I mistaken?
No, it's a water. This is everything we've been talking about.
It's only a water problem. Okay.
Well, it's not only a water problem,
Okay.
but
It's worse.
the water sector has couple issues.
I'm sorry.
We've got limited revenue streams, right? There's just not a lot of other sources. There's no Visa card for water, right? You're either gonna get it from tariffs, And as Rachel called it this morning, the valley of death issue in water is this 60 or 70-year discussion that we've been having, whether water is a human right or an economic commodity, okay? And unfortunately, we have this discussion, everyone shrugs and says water should be cheap or free, and everyone nods their head, and then the discussion never moves forward. So what we need to start thinking about is how. If you want to give a discount or reduce the price of water, that's fine. As I said, it's a public policy in medical care and healthcare, in education and other sectors. We've not even gone to the Treasury and say, hey, you committed to water as a human right, give us some more money. We don't even do that in the water sector. So we haven't even started the conversation. Then, a lot of the reasons you need to attract that private investment, you need to look at your operations, right? And if you're losing 40% of your assets that you can sell, it's going to be pretty damn hard to get money, whether it's climate finance from the teacher's pension fund or short-term debt to upgrade your fleet. So these are all basic questions that basically we're not really addressing in many places. So it's more than a climate issue. It's more than a climate finance issue.
And I'm just going to add one more thing, because I know there's another question, is in addition to all of that, the reality is that there are alternatives. So if you are a private citizen working, living in one of these, let's just name your any global south city, right? And your utility, you do not have trust in your utility, you will find an alternative water provider. You will find a private provider who will either drill you a borehole or deliver tanker water to you, right? Like you will pay to not have that utilities water.
Right.
And there's an element in here in terms of utility reform around, well, how do you get the trust of that tier of customer back? I think often in the water sector, in these conferences and these venues, we often are talking about how can we serve low-income populations, but we've already, in many places where I've worked over the years, you've already lost the high-income population too, right? And so we as development professionals don't like to talk about the high-income people, but actually they are part of the revenue base. They are the customers you want. And so but you can't force them. They might actually like and prefer their private provider to the public utility. And so we need to reckon with that in terms of thinking about this creditworthiness problem, is it's not just about attracting external financing. A World Bank loan is not gonna solve the problem that your higher income population has no trust in the utility services because your service levels are terrible, right? I wanted to just add and complement what you're saying.
And I'm coming to you, I promise.
Sorry.
But just to compound it further, yesterday Claire Chase mentioned we're leaving 30 cents on the dollar on the table in the water sector. Let me explain that. Every year at the start of the fiscal year, there's a budget, let's say for $1, okay? And over the course of the year, and this is whether it's in Haiti or in the Netherlands, okay? We looked at 70 different countries around the world. At the beginning of the fiscal year, money was put into the water ministry and the utilities to deliver services. Our spend rate at the end of the fiscal year was 70%. So it's very difficult to run around and say we don't have any money when we're not even spending the money we have efficiently, number one. Number two, there's another study that was done not only on tariffs, but also on subsidies. You know who's getting most of the subsidy money in the water sector? 58% of the money is going to the top quintile, top 20%, okay? These are not financial issues. These are policy issues and implementation issues that have to be rectified so that we can deliver our services, become efficient, and ultimately become creditworthy. Right?
Yeah, so we have already evolved into another discussion. I was actually thinking about the fact that losing the high-income people in water, maybe it's also true in education and health, where you also still have the discussion in education and health, where it's probably good or it's a commodity. But my question was actually about investing in what utilities utilities, etc., about predictability, where these water utilities work in. Certainly, when pension funds and other kinds of bonds invest in water utilities, I'm from the Netherlands, and I'm working for Ammerveld Africa, looking at scaling sanitation markets and scaling water providers and entrepreneurs. You need a standard to scale, you need a standard model to scale, but you need also the predictability of the environment where you invest in. And what's your perspective on this? So you can have your water utility, you have your top list of where to put your money in and where to invest. But how, in a business case, how are you addressing or mitigating the unpredictability of where water utilities operate, be it social or climate or etc.?
That's a big question.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's good, I like it.
Can I
So,
give
Joel-
a partial answer? So in my newfound leisure, I have started to do more writing, and I've just put out very short, but I just put something out on something that we talk about in the course, which is credit rating agencies. Now, I'm not sure how familiar people are with credit rating agencies. There's about 70 around the world. There are 4 big ones that everyone kind of knows. This isn't about your individual credit rating. This is the credit rating of an institution, whether it be a car company or a water utility. There are credit ratings. And the big ones that you may have heard of are S&P Global, Moody's, and Fitch. And what they'll do is they'll come in, and if you have kids, it's a little bit like your kid's report card, right? It comes in, they look under the hood, they look at how you're doing, they look at your non-revenue water, they look at your collections, they look at the number of staff you have compared to the number of customers you have. And based on that, they give a rating. Now, very, very important to understand. That rating is backwards looking, okay? They do not make a prediction going forward. But if you go to the capital market and continue to raise money, one of the requirements in the global north is usually that every year you get this checkup. And while there's been hiccups in the credit rating process, most recently around 2008 with the mortgage crisis that occurred in the US that then spread around the world, at the subnational level, on this kind of infrastructure, these credit ratings have been put in place since the 1920s, and generally, it's worked. Now, I'm not saying go off and invest in a utility that has a poor credit rating, but that's one way where there is some ability to look at the health. It's done independently. It's not a consultant paid for by the utility. And they're very sensitive to their reputation, because if there starts to be a collapse and things fall apart, they're going to lose their reputation. So that's one aspect of that, but there are other things. Every time you go to the market, these guys have to do audited financial statements. They go through a lot of rigor. Robert's going to come in a minute, I hope, and talk about regulation. There is a look at the regulatory market. If the minister can come in 6 weeks before an election and declare a holiday on rates, you'll know about it, right? That's one of the problems that we see in this sector. So I would say one answer is predictability, but also transparency.
Yeah, I was going to answer the question with something similar along the lines of data, of having consistent data systems for tracking things, which actually then, what's happening in the credit space, credit rating space, I should say, is it's very hard. Like there's a really great study that CEPT University, it's CEPT, University out of Ahmedabad in India. They have a Center for Water and Sanitation, and they put out some really amazing stuff around municipal finance and water and sanitation and things. And they recently came out with a self-assessment credit assessment tool that's super, super handy, and I'd highly encourage reading the report. But one of the key findings...
Actually, there's one on the back of the course, sorry.
Oh, all right, yeah, these guys,
if the water provider puts their financial information in, there's not a credit rating, but it's called a credit index.
Oh, yeah, nice, awesome. Well, so the thing is that, what they found, even just surveying municipalities in India, is that a lot of the credit ratings that happened for municipalities were just one-offs. So it was like, oh, there's a donor project, and so we're gonna do this review, right? Rather than this sort of systematic data where there's an annual checkup, where it's, in part because doing it is expensive when the service provider and the regulator don't have uniform data standards. So it gets really, so I think in terms of thinking about scale, in terms of thinking about growth, the data and the information to inform the market that you're working in is actually is something that shouldn't be projectized. It should be part of your program. And those are wonky words, but it shouldn't be this one-off thing. It should just be a routine part of what you do as part of managing an asset or managing a service, is understanding and having good analytics that are transparent and that can be, integrated into decision-making. What we see a lot is that the data is not integrated into decision-making, that it's a one-off, that it's funded by this grant over there or that grant, and that there's a million KPIs that are donor-driven, from the, it's just kind of a mess. And so that, I don't know if that answers your question. I also, because it is a really big question you've asked, do other people in the room have answers or suggestions? And so, and I have to ask you to restate the question too, just because now we've all been, Joel and I've kind of been chatting for a bit.
I think so on a utility, I can imagine that on a utility level, for example, or on a municipal level, you can think of in a country or even in a regional setting, you can standardize the data and the kind of KPIs and then have that operationalized that everybody reports against these data, so you can do a credit assessment from this utility or municipality or district against the other in the same country or different countries or even global, but that's maybe a long shot. However, I think that apart from do the credit rating then on a utility level, we may have a problem that the utility is set in a certain setting, flood-prone area, conflicts, etc. And do you want to include that in the credit rating, or is it an addendum towards the credit rating to say we have the business, okay, we know where to go, but we're in a volatile area or fragile state. I don't want to go there. But
that's often included. That's all in formal ratings. They look at the governance and administrative systems. Yeah. And someone may ask, well, what if you're not a utility? What if you're a community-based organization or something less formal? The beauty of the water sector is there's about 30 key performance indicators that you can look at. And in fact, there's something called IBNet that you can look across the spectrum. So you can look at a utility in Mindanao in the Philippines and compare it to something in Uganda and then something in Latin America if you want to see what the difference is. So it's not a formal rating, but it does give you those insights.
Yeah.
Right.
And does an aqua rating offer something similar?
Aqua rating is something done by the IADB that is now being rolled out in other parts of the world. Yes. And sorry, Robert, why don't you come up and you can go next. But as you're coming, you can also do a shadow rating. Rachel mentioned this, and just so everyone understands this, a credit rating can run anywhere between $25,000 and $100,000. Okay, so it can be relative, and it can be even cheaper. But that's a formal rating that is then available to the market. And we certainly don't recommend you initially do a credit rating. And we certainly don't recommend that the first one you do is a public rating, because it will be out there. But there's something called, you can do a credit assessment, which is much more informal, or the credit rating agencies will do what they call a shadow credit rating, or there's another silly name that I can't remember at the moment. But basically, you sign a contract that you will not release the information. So they'll come in, they'll assess it, and you'll say, you're okay. And then they sit down with you and they say, well, this is what you need to do to improve. So it's worth doing, right? So we have about 20 minutes and some change, and some of you this morning were here for Robert, in addition to Rachel. Robert is the former regulator of WASREP in Kenya. Everybody clap. I introduced Robert this morning, and I will introduce him again tomorrow, is one of the best regulators that I've worked with in emerging markets anywhere in the world. Now, it's a smaller group than we would prefer. There's a lot of countries that don't have regulators. But Robert's a resource that's here, and we really wanted to provide the opportunity. He'll be there again tomorrow, and we'll be able to ask questions. But Robert, I want you to talk for about 5 minutes on why regulation and what some of the challenges are, but what's the real benefit, and then we can take a couple questions, if that's all right. And some of the folks were in the room this morning, so you can summarize.
Okay, thank you very much, and sorry for joining the session later as in another session. But when it comes to regulation, I think we discussed quite a lot in the morning, but I want to say that in regulation, you really want to make sure that providers are actually giving the service they are meant to give in terms of their mandate.
Speak up, sorry. You'll speak up. No, why don't you go to the phone, sorry.
Because regulation is about policy implementation. I mean, as countries, we have our policies in terms of the objectives we want to meet, but implementation of those policies, there are always those gaps between policy and practice and all that. So regulator is there to make sure that policy is implemented and the targets are being met as far as what the country aspirations are in terms of water and sanitation service provision. But you also, because we work in a sector that is very difficult to have competition, that's why the economists tell me it's called natural monopoly. People out there in those service provision space can actually misuse their power in terms of even trying to organize investments, even in terms of maintenance and all that. So the regulator is actually supposed to make sure that they do that. And as they do that, they know that there are resources required. So the regulator also protects you as you try to get your resources instead of getting cost-reflective tariffs, if I would say. But an important thing also is to make sure that for the regulator, it's important to make sure that utilities are able to plan long-term, because our sector requires long-term plans. You don't just get what you want just within the short time that we normally have as political cycles and all that, but you need long-term. If you are going to implement infrastructure, it's infrastructure that is going to serve you for quite a long time. But having said that, regulation is a means to an end. You want to really have you want to meet some targets for service provision, some policy objectives. It's a means to an end. But you have to start that the fundamentals are right. Your technical operational efficiency is right, and also your governance structures are also right, and they are also being implemented the best way possible. If there is a governance function that is going to be done, it is also done. Again, regulation is part of governance actually. So you cannot have good governance for water sports without an effective regulatory framework. But it's important, even as you establish regulation, I'm just emphasizing this from the morning, it is a means to an end, and you must be very clear why you want a regulator. So that when it comes to implementation, it is not there will still be a lot of push and pull, but at least you are clear from the beginning that you needed a regulator to address the sector problems for the long term.
So, questions about regulation? There were a ton this morning. All right, while we're waiting, Robert, talk about the different kinds of regulations. You have financial, there's the economics. Could you just...
And of course, you have the economic regulation, which is really about costs of service, quality of service, and actually setting and monitoring and changing the allowed costs for regulation. But you also have public health regulation, and a lot of to do with drinking water regulation, of course, falls within that, but it can also fall within the quality of service, because water quality is part of the quality of service you are giving people. But you also have environmental regulation. A lot of regulation for water and sanitation services where I've mostly worked is really about economic regulation. It's also about social regulation and making sure that no one is left behind. Service providers have a way of cherry picking that they don't want to go into the difficult areas, yet everybody needs a service. Everybody within your service area is a customer. Is a customer for you as a regulator. So the regulator has to, for the utility. So the regulator has to make sure that everybody is covered, and the priorities are those ones who have no service, because the provider can spend all the resources and time trying to improve services and then leaving others with nothing. So the priority has to be clear that it is those ones who do not have service. The investment plans have also to be clear, and the costs in terms of actually serving those people have also to be clear. But also, you are also on the lookout for any emerging problems, any emerging risks, so that you see how we can address. But as you implement that as a regulator, I think you have to think ahead of the providers, so that as problems come, the providers are very happy when they come to you and you have no solution. There is no way a regulator can even appear to have no solution for a problem. Thank you.
I will try.
Hang on 1 second, go ahead in the back.
I will try a question. I'm working for Amref South Africa, based in Nairobi. We're headquartered in Kenya. And with Amref, we are working in the wash sector. And I'm working in the wash sector, and let me use the sanitation markets. Trying to working with multiple counties in which we are working, creating a sanitation market. And then as a project-driven NGO, we are at the end of our project, and we're looking at the sustainability of our intervention and actually having a discussion internally how we flip the project, instead of the NGO coming in or us coming in, trying to change the sanitation market, and hopefully the local government, the county government takes it upon them and it is sustainable. Looking for, should the dynamic not be looking for aspiring local governments that want to have a certain ambition, where Amref South Africa in this case then delivers certain expertise to get this county government there. So in that, trying to crack how to have an enabling environment that is there. What is the relation between an NGO, Amref or anybody else, and the regulator in order to push or put on the agenda towards county governments in Kenya, for example, but could be other governments in other countries as well, so that county governments feel pressure from the regulator, from maybe the community constituents and the NGO to take up the responsibility.
All right, hold on, I'll let you think about that. You had a question as well?
Yes, hi, I'm a researcher, and my question is, I think a somewhat general one, which is how is the climate transition changing the challenges of regulation? Because we talked about sort of climate finance, but I wanted to just foreground the climate challenge and how you frame it, and what some of the kind of regulatory policy shifts have been, and then how that then trickles down to how you interact with service providers.
Great question. I thought I saw another here, okay.
I'll ask a question. So I work with the National Water and Sanitation Authority in Haiti, DNEPA, and they were set up with a dual mandate. On one hand, they're supposed to be the regulator, but on the other hand, they're the ones who manage the loans or grants from the World Bank, from the IDB, and so they're directly involved in the implementation. So my question is, could this work, or is this just a failed mission?
Okay, hang on, there's one, I knew there was somebody in the back, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Kalina. I work for the research institute called AFIA. And I have some experience working also with WASR actually, so this is a specific question about kind of the role of regulators to try to identify incentives and not just disincentives for people not to do certain things or to do certain things. And specifically I'm talking about this is the case of trying to regulate small-scale providers of water or sanitation, specifically thinking about small-scale water providers. I think there's a lot of focus from regulators to try and, disincentivize by penalizing people who are not, moving towards a system where you penalize vendors, for example, who are not licensed or who are doing things incorrectly, rather than trying to think of incentives to bring vendors into kind of a certified system of water provision. And So I wonder is there a role for a regulator to play to identify incentives as well?
That doesn't work. So you cannot claim to be a regulator and you are implementing. Surely that's a conflict of interest. But I'm sure I had it.
Check that one.
Sessions. So with respect to change, regulators want to look at change. We may want to highlight climate change, sorry, Rachel. We may want to highlight climate change, but regulators want to look at change. Change in terms of population, change in terms of land use, and change in terms of climate. But I still want to challenge the people who are actually meant to be managing these services. I think if you are going to manage a water service and you are looking at the climate change, the climate impacts, for example, on the water source or water resource or whatever, there is data. Because one of the problems we have is data. There is data that shows how maybe the water resource has changed in terms of quantity and quality. And you actually design for these kind of things. That in a way is indirectly also appreciating there is change, and that some of that change may have come out of climate, for example. So what's my point? I do not want us to just highlight so much climate change that came yesterday. No, I think this is something that has been happening, but we as professionals are also challenged as you manage, as you design, as you plan these systems, how do you account for these changes in whatever resources you are actually planning for? Maybe. But remember, there is also urbanization. The populations are rising like I don't know what. So how do you plan for that? How do you make sure that you are not? It's not kind of a knee-jerk kind of reaction in terms of trying to address the challenges that are brought about by that. So I'm not saying that I have issues to do with climate change or no climate change. My problem is from where I come from, we have a lot to do in terms of, for example, adapting. Look at our disasters. In my country, for example, more than 70% of the disasters are either because of too much water, too little. I don't want to go into the too polluted. So what does that mean? That means we are not actually supplying. We are not actually storing water either artificially or naturally. So we continue destroying the catchments and all that. Then we complain about climate change. I really want us to be candid about where the problems are coming from. So in my view, I think regulators are in that vantage position to highlight these risks and actually bring in collective thinking and collective action about what to be done. Regulators do not disincentivize providers. I want to correct that. What is our objective in terms of making sure that everybody, in fact, we ought to have a level playing field. Where it appears like disincentivize, you better check again. Maybe that small water provider there were doubts about where they are getting their source water from. And you have cases where they get the source water from the same network that's supposed to be working properly to supply people. And I'm not saying that's what they do, but we have had a number of incidents like that. So regulators are able, in fact, in my country, I think we even have a license, a simplified license document for small water providers. It doesn't mean that you have to start already being penalized. In fact, they don't even pay any license fee in the beginning. But you just want to bring them into the mainstream, because in the end, some of them will actually be made irrelevant as these other providers actually expand on their service areas and actually get more resources to actually expand services to these areas, which could be depending on informal service provision. And we have examples in Kenya for that, where you can see a provider is complaining about a bigger provider taking up its service area, but that is a licensed provider. And for that particular moment, we are already moving into that area, so you become irrelevant. And I think communities are very happy when they just get a formalized and mandated service provider. There was another question.
I think you got it. Climate and the regulator.
Yes, that one I've answered.
Yeah, and the AMREF question about moving to sanitation markets?
The AMREF question is an interesting one, because I always ask this. I used to ask these questions. I don't ask them these days because I'm retired. If you are an NGO working in the water sector, do you have an exit strategy? Because at some point, you are going to actually exit. So, unfortunately for many of them, I've only worked with one program that we were discussing an exit strategy in the midterm of the project. And this is a project that is ending now, run by the University of Oxford. And I was really impressed that we were already discussing an exit strategy some years before they actually leave. So let's not talk about exit when you are exiting. Let's talk about exit when you are starting. And my questions would be, how have you responded to the plans that whoever is mandated to provide had? Did you just come on opportunistically, found a gap, and you thought that I can do this through this strategy and all that? Or is it something you could proactively discuss with a mandated provider in terms of them having plans, that this is how we are going to supply, of course, when we have these challenges, but are we able now to see how we can now, as an NGO or whoever other actor, fit into those plans? Because that is one of the biggest problems. You don't have partners and other collaborators actually feeding or supporting the plans of the mandated institution to actually provide that services. They come with their own plans, so they derail everywhere, all the providers in terms of what they should focus on. So you're out there trying to punch some holes on the ground and claiming that there is water. But when people see water, that's the end. But when you go down to the water, you are testing it, the water is not even suitable for whatever, the bore was not even done to the standards, and everything falls apart. So these are some of the things we want to avoid in regulation, that you actually have asset development standards, you have asset management standards. Don't talk about the costs of it, because some of these things are just meant to kind of maybe, I don't know, they don't really amount to much in the end, because at the end of the day, we must have professional standards in whatever we do, and that is one of the pillars that will kind of support sustainability of that service and sustainability of that asset in terms of its management and in terms of that asset continuing to provide the services that it is meant for.
Okay, more. Please, way in the back and then next. And please be quick, because we're...
I'm Kazi from Capital Action, Bangladesh. So thank you very much. I was not present at the beginning of the presentation, so I'm not sure whether my question will be relevant or not. Due to increase of climate-induced disaster, so there will be a lot of migration in country, like maybe from the rural area there will be more migration, internal migration to urban. So in such case, the roles and responsibility of the regulators will be to provide that support to the community who will be living in the informal setting at the urban area. So whether do we have that type of policies, and do we need to think about those at this moment and have that type of strategies? And also in the current situation, the regulators, whether if they do not follow the existing policies, how CSOs or other organizations can hold them accountable. So that is my question. I hope this is relevant to the discussion.
Okay, and then there was a question in front.
Yeah, so I had experience with 2 utilities that did receive results from performance evaluations. It was a modified version of operating, and then also a report from a regulator. And the utilities, they responded very differently to the recommendations, which were essentially the same for good governance.
Sorry, this was the regulator gave recommendations on operations?
They audited the financial report.
Oh, okay. But the regulator did it, or the auditor general did it?
They didn't do it. It was our program did.
Your program?
Yeah.
Ah, okay.
They did some user registry updating, they found more customers, they realized their service areas were not totally covered, and then they were measuring NRW much better and trying to go out and fix leaks. But then they just both ran into the barriers of they could not raise tariffs. And that's kind of where my involvement ended, and I don't know what happened. What can they do post that? You just get a hard no from government that, we're not going to be updating methodology for tariff calculations this year or next year. What can you do?
Okay, Mr.
I'm
Regulator.
not sure I understand that question.
Not keeping tariffs low. How can they argue against it?
No, they can't. You see, there's something I mentioned about when I talked about tariffs. You are presenting justified costs. The regulator will approve justified costs. And it doesn't mean that you have to afford them, but those are justified costs, and they guide towards any subsidies that may come about. So in my case, for example, every subsidy was supposed to be approved within a tariff regime, was supposed to be approved by the regulator. The regulator knows that there is this amount of subsidy being given to this provider. Without that, then I think it will not really be as transparent as it should be. So it's important to understand that yes, there is justified cost, but then there is that affordability issue that you have to consider, and affordability varies depending on the context. So in my view, you have to really talk about justified costs included in regulation.
So, and then the regulations and CSOs, and then regulate climate and migration.
The way we look at it myself, I have not really dealt a lot in terms of experience in terms of migration, but you look at it in terms of disasters. The regulator has what I would call disaster management guidelines. They may not be required to be applied in any way, but it is always important for the provider to think about disasters. And disasters are many, including even water contamination is a disaster. So how deal with it? So by law, every provider is supposed to actually have a disaster kind of fund, which you can use. It may not necessarily be enough, but you can use to at least have the initial response in terms of saving lives or protecting lives and whatever. And then you're able now to appeal now for even more funds. But at least it is something you had planned for. It is not something that just caught you by surprise. And this requires you to also learn your system in terms from the water resources, because there could also be disasters at that level, and also in terms of water resources itself, and also in terms of the distribution system, what can actually impact on the distribution system. With respect to migration, I really do not have a lot of experience in that, because I've not experienced any such kind of thing. But I would imagine that if people migrate to within a water service provider area, they come into the water service provider area, that's an emergency in a way, and somehow you have to provide them with minimum means of survival, and water is part of that.
Can I add to I just want to add to the migration question. So one of the things that I often do when I'm entering into a place I've not been before, even when I'm entering places I've been before many times, is I often just want to understand what the denominator is and what the service area is. Like, what are the market boundaries? So even for like a regulator, the regulator is looking at how the service provider is functioning in a defined service area. And so if you have a migrant population of people moving from one area, whether that's internally within a single country or externally, that's part of planning and accommodating for services in that defined area. And so there's something just about, I think, oftentimes we don't, when a shock happens, people move and migrate. And it's interesting to think about, are there ways to use data, this is the wrong slide to have up here, but to actually help inform, well, where are people moving? Are they moving, are they following and going to where their families are they going, what are their needs? So that both the regulator, in terms of, can have that information from the service provider to be able to prepare and plan and program and have it be in a more organized way than just chaos, right? So I think there's just this element of keeping mind of the market boundaries that we're operating in, which again doesn't fully answer your question, but maybe is adding a little bit of nuance to Robert's response.
And there was one more question in the back. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Thank you. Again, it's from Minister of Environment representing the National Hydrological Resource Institute here. Coming to regulation, sometimes when we try to regulate, and things could become worse. I just discovered that in terms of carbon market, the water market, represent a very interesting opportunity where to orient regulation. Based on your experience, what would be the profile of the good regulation in terms of climate finance, carbon market?
Your question's, what's a good profile of good regulations that could positively impact climate?
Yeah.
Go ahead, you can start.
I mean, a good regulation would be to, there's something of, I want to say something about non-revenue water.
Well,
It feels like the easiest win is
Yeah.
non-revenue water.
I was
Get that down, benchmark that.
Efficiency.
I was gonna say, the answer for good regulation related to climate starts with good regulation related to the provision of water. Okay? So, non-revenue water, your collections, you're looking at your staffing numbers as opposed to the number of customers you have. There's these 30 key performance indicators that you can look at and tell very quickly whether or not you're a well-run utility or service provider or local government. And I would argue very strongly that if you are, you're well on the way to starting to become very positive in terms of addressing the climate issues. It's not to say everything's perfect, but that would be the place to start. Okay, so we're past our time, thank you. Just briefly, I would urge everyone to come to the meeting in the main hall tomorrow at 10:30. New and different things will be discussed, I promise, but you'll have more time for better questions after you've been able to sleep on them tonight. So thank you very, very much.
It's so condensed and it's so amazing.
Yeah, sorry, there should be a couple more.
Can I raise you as a
You can, but I can't do it right now. Yeah.